Now, the base ISO by default is set to an auto selection. This is interesting because in the R5 you have the same dual base mode. It can shift the base sensitivity, flick to different circuitry to get cleaner results at higher ISOs, but you don't have control over that. Whereas in the R5C and the cinema menu, you do. You can take control of the base ISO selection and you can manually assign it. So in auto mode, essentially as I adjust the ISO, it will automatically and pretty sensibly flick across. So I'm at 160 ISO at the moment, for example, and if I started to manually move up, and maybe I had a particularly dark scene I needed to move up to higher ISOs, maybe 800, whatever it might be, it will automatically flick across to the higher base ISO of 640. Now, these levels, the base ISO 160 and 640, they do change. So don't be confused if you ever come in here and they look different. It is based on your custom picture mode. So if you're shooting with a different gamma, for example, these will change. So let me show you what I mean. If I go into base 160, you can see I'm currently set to, oh, hang on, I've pressed my display button. There we go. You can see that I'm currently set to that 160. Now, if I go in and go to my custom picture mode, you can see I'm currently in BT709, just a standard Rec 709 gamma with video color matrix. But if I move across now, let's go to, for example, WideDR. Now with WideDR, let's have a look. You can see the ISO has now gone to 400. And if I move back to my base ISO, you'll see that the selection has changed. Instead of saying auto selection with 160 and 640, I now have auto selection with 400 and 1600. Those are the base ISO settings when you're in WideDR. Now if I go across to my custom picture again, and this time I'm going to go into Canon Log 3. Let's go here, there we go. You can see once again it has changed, and now it has the options of 800 or 3200. Essentially, as I'm using picture profiles that give me more roll off in the highlights and more control over the dynamic range of my scene, so obviously I get almost none with Rec 709. I only get that sort of nasty dogleg that Rec 709 has at the top. WideDR, get a different. I'm actually going to dive into these gammas in more detail in a separate part later on, so I won't sort of drill down too far, but with WideDR we get more roll off in the highlights, so I'm getting a higher base ISO in those modes. And then the maximum, obviously, dynamic range setting, which is Canon Log 3 on this camera, that's when I get the highest ISO levels. That juggling of the ISO versus the gamma is all about the engineers who have made this camera optimizing the image in terms of noise versus dynamic range. So that's why they change. If you're in auto, you never need to think about this because, of course, as you change various gammas in your custom picture mode, it's automatically choosing the best one dependent on where you have set your ISO manually. But if you want to take complete control over this, you can, and you can adjust it accordingly depending to which custom profile you're in. What I would strongly recommend is, if this is a new camera to you, is to experiment with these different gammas versus the various different base ISOs and just see where you get the best results. So for example, when I'm in Canon Log 3 and I need to be above 800 ISO, it's a dark scene, I need, let's say, another stop or so of light. At 3200, it's obviously going to be clean, but at 1600, if I'm in a base 800, it's obviously a little bit noisier. It makes sense actually to switch to a base ISO manually of 3200 and then set manually your ISO to 1600. Now it wouldn't do that if you're in auto selection mode. It would keep it in a base ISO of 800 if you went to 1600. But by manually putting it in base ISO of 3200 and setting it to 1600, you actually end up with a cleaner result than you would do otherwise. It's considerably cleaner than 1600 when you're in a base of 800. Now you do sacrifice a little bit of dynamic range, but that might be something that you don't care about. You might have something that's not particularly dynamic scene, but is quite dark, in which case you're going to get the lowest noise profile by manually choosing 3200 and setting it at 1600. Um, you really need to experiment. You need to kind of do these tests. Don't just take my word for it. See what you're comfortable with in terms of noise. You might want to never have to use noise reduction plugins, and therefore you want to get this right in camera. You might be using a very quick system, and you know your system can eat up noise reduction plugins. It doesn't matter too much, doesn't affect the speed too much, in which case you can obviously get away with a bit more. But by knowing those boundaries and testing those boundaries, then when you're in that situation in real life, you can confidently choose the correct setting in here. I'm going to go back to auto. Now I'm back in BT709. If I come back across, beneath that, I have my ISO/gain, so I can choose whether or not I see an ISO or a gain measurement. They're just different units. They're showing the same information, but you're just using a different unit of measurement. Those of you that have come from a photographic background will probably want to leave it on ISO, so that you can see, you know, here I am at 800 ISO. These will be familiar measurements and stops that you'll be used to working with. 400, there you go, I've just taken a stop off. And you've got presets along the top there. You can register new presets as well, which is very useful using the register button. I can scroll with my finger across the top here. I can use these arrow keys. There's lots of very convenient ways I can do that. I can also just use the dial under my index finger on the top of the camera if I want to. But if I go back to, let's go back to our base here, because remember we're now back in Rec 709, so our base is 160. If I just change this ISO to gain, again, I must stress this isn't changing your exposure. It's just changing the unit of measurements. That's all it is. So the unit's being used. You can see that it's actually shot up to 42 decibels. I'm going to use the preset to take that back to 0. On other Canon cameras, if you flick between ISO and gain, whatever decibel you were in equivalent in ISO, when you flick across it's the same. So for example, if I was at 200 ISO on the C70 and flicked into gain, it would show me 0 dB because they are the same thing. I have noticed specifically to the R5C that it remembers them independently. So if I set my dB to 12, for example, and then go to ISO, you'll see my ISO is still at 160, which is actually the equivalent of 0 dB, because that's the base. That's what that means when you talk about the base ISO. You're talking about the point at which no additional power is going through the sensor, and that is, in decibels, that is 0. Think of it the same way as a microphone. Yeah, so 0 is no boosting of the signal at all. So at 0 dB, we are essentially at the base. As I said, with the R5C, it independently maintains those two modes, which actually is a bit frustrating because it was always quite useful to be able to demonstrate to people with all of the rest of the Canon Cinema EOS line that you can easily find out what the base sensitivity of that camera is by setting it to 0 dB, flicking back into ISO, and there it would show you the equivalent ISO. Whereas on the R5C, it won't do that. If I go back into gain, you'll see it's still at 12 dB. So it's kind of a shame on the one hand. I guess actually it's also quite useful. I guess there may be an argument that you particularly want to always leave your dB at 0 if you want to quickly get to the base, but then when you're in ISO mode you can go wherever you want to. It's probably something to do with the dual base system that the camera uses, but it's just something to flag up that's different and unique to the R5C from the rest of the Cinema EOS line. So I would advise you to leave your dB at 0, and I'm going to go back into ISO. Now, the ISO gain mode, which is underneath there, is essentially a way of turning the ISO or gain into an automatic mode, very much like the automatic iris that I showed you before. When I'm in automatic mode here, it will automatically adjust the ISO to expose the image, again, based on its internal exposure, its center weighted kind of internal exposure that it's automatically judging. As such, I would not, again, for the same reasons, I wouldn't typically use this. I want to have ownership over that exposure and know what's happening, but particularly in terms of noise profiles. But it can be very useful if you've got a changing scene and you want it to be able to adapt to it. What you can do if noise is a concern in this mode is you'll notice that now I'm in automatic, an additional option has become available at the bottom, which is to set a limit for the auto mode. It defaults to off, but I can say, look, actually, let's have a limit of, now this is an interesting one. What would I set it to? I have happily shot at 6,400 on this camera. In fact, I have shot stuff at 12,800, and with a tiny bit of noise reduction, it's been very, very usable. But let's say I was being quite conservative, I could set that up to limit the auto mode to never go above 6,400, for example. So you do have that kind of fallback if you want to. And just like with the Iris, I have the ability to change whether or not I make ISO or gain adjustments in whole stops or third stops, which again just gives you a little bit more control, finer gradations in those changes. Or if you're always confused and only think in whole stops, you can set it to whole stops and work that way if you want to. Okay, so let's go back into manual, and the last thing to talk about here is the extended range for the ISO and gain. It's off by default, but I can turn that on. When that's on, if I come out and go into my ISO, you can see that I can get all the way up to 102,400. Look at that noise. Beautiful with the lens cap on there. So I can go all the way up to there. Now, if I go back into the menu, set that to off, come back out, you will see that the maximum is 25,600. So that's the extended range mode. Maybe you're doing some kind of, I don't know, spy work and image quality isn't your utmost concern. You just need to be able to capture something. Maybe it's some natural history work or something like that. You're in the bushes at night trying to capture foxes. Who knows? But you have your extended mode if you want it down there. So I'm going to make sure that mine is set to off and just double check. I think all of my settings are now back to where I normally have them. We have essentially there just covered our exposure triangle. So we've talked about iris or aperture. We've talked about our shutter speed, shutter angles and such like. And we've covered ISO or gain, our sensitivity. Of course, as well as our three main exposure triangle ways of adjusting exposure, there are two other ways, the best ways, one might argue, which is light. Obviously, we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment, but also ND. Now, with a camera like this, which is a mirrorless camera, it is not the body is not that of a cinema body, and this is where it is a true hybrid. It's the body of a mirrorless stills camera, albeit with an extra fan on the back. And therefore you don't have built-in NDs. It would be mind-bogglingly brilliant if it had built-in NDs. It would be fantastic, and if Canon can shrink that technology down enough to fit it in a body of this size in the future, that would be huge. But for now, what we have to rely on are NDs. Now, you can obviously get whole stop, multiple NDs and screw on the one that you think you might need in a particular given instance. Or, of course, in terms of operability and speed of use, it makes sense to use a Vari ND. Now, the Vari NDs that I use are these. These are the Freewell Vari NDs. They are fantastic. I have done a fair amount of research with Vari NDs in anticipation of having to use them again, because I hadn't had to use them for years when I got the R5C. And the various different makes that I tested, and there were a good 6 or 7 different brands that I tested. The Freewell ones gave the least amount of color shift. They maintained the most amount of sharpness. And just in terms of kind of usability, they're very nice, they're well made. But, and here's the really big thing, they are, I think I'm right in saying, the cheapest ones that I tested. If not the cheapest, probably the second most cheapest. Really, really good value, but incredible results. So it's a win-win. They are incredible Vari NDs. By using Vari NDs, of course, I can limit how much light is coming in through the lens and adjust my exposure that way. It's worth spending the time and finding a solution that works for you, one that you're comfortable with, one that gives you the best results. If you want to test Vari NDs and not just take my word for it, then you can get a range of ones to test. Just point your camera at a white balance chart. They are designed to be completely pigment free, so there's absolutely no way if your camera is white balanced correctly and pointing at a white balance chart that any kind of tint should be introduced. And if you white balance with the lens that you're going to use on and then put the ND on, you can look at that under a vector scope and you can judge how far that is shifting off the middle point. There is a very small amount of color shift. There actually kind of has to be, just because of the way that these filters work. They're essentially two polarizing filters working in tandem. But that cross-polarization that can affect these, and certainly the color shift that can affect these, is very minimal with the Freewell ones. And I found that not only was it the smallest amount of color shift, it was also moving up the flesh tone line on the vector scope. So it was kind of like putting a very subtle cosmetic peach filter on your light. It was a very nice result, to be honest. So NDs are the other thing to bear in mind. When it comes to the exposure of your image, obviously this tangentially fits in with your gammas, because of course the gammas change the way that black to white is mapped when you're recording with the camera. So as such, the exposure appears to change. That's quite an important distinction. It only appears to change. Your exposure is your exposure, and you set that using iris, shutter, ISO, sensitivity, NDs, light. Changing your gamma doesn't change your exposure. Very common misinterpretation of what gamma's doing, because it visibly looks like it's changing the exposure on your screen. If you're not using a view assist, for example, or a display LUT, it's very easy to assume that your exposure is changing, but it isn't. Now, before I dive into the custom picture menu and all of the various items in there, there's one extra thing that I need to talk about, and that is dynamic range and the impact that your ISO settings are going to be having on the dynamic range of the R5C. When you are at the base ISO setting with the camera, that's where you're getting the cleanest image, but it isn't necessarily where you're getting the maximum dynamic range from the sensor. So when you're getting the maximum dynamic range of the sensor, with the R5C, that's typically when you're at 800 or above in log 3. So that's where you're going to be getting the maximum dynamic range out of the sensor. But that's not necessarily the cleanest setting. So these base settings are all about low level noise, where you're trying to minimize noise. Whereas, just bear in mind, if maximum dynamic range is the name of the game, then it makes sense actually to be at 800 or above and in log 3. Now, when you're in log 3, the base settings, as we saw, go to 800 and 3.2, so you're going to be there anyway. So it's almost a moot point. However, it's just worth bearing in mind that the optimum dynamic range is only going to come when you are in that log 3 mode. Now, that may seem blatantly obvious to you, but it is worth bearing in mind. What is also worth bearing in mind is that if you start to lower your ISO when you're in log 3 and you start to go below that base of 800, what you're going to start to see is, yes, the image will get darker, obviously, but what you won't necessarily see is that the maximum dynamic range of the image is getting less, but also it's shifting down. So if you've got a particularly dark scene and you're worried about there being too much noise in the dark areas of the scene, then it conversely, sort of opposite of what your intuition would tell you, it makes sense to actually come down and lower your ISO below that base setting. So for example, if you're in log 3 and your base is set to 800, but you have a dark scene, it's not a very dynamic scene, so it's not a huge amount of dynamic range, so something like what I'm shooting now, in fact, you can sacrifice that dynamic range. So it's 14 stops when you're in log 3 at 800 or above. If you don't need 14 stops, if your scene doesn't contain 14 stops of dynamic range, you can sacrifice that dynamic range, but more importantly, you can also lower it down so that you're getting more detail in the shadows by just bringing it down. So as you come down to, say, 400 or 200, your maximum dynamic range shrinks, but that's not a problem if your scene doesn't contain that much dynamic range anyway. But also, it's going to move that sensitivity down. So now, more stops of dynamic range are below middle grey than they were when it was at 800. Now, this is the case with all cameras, but it's just worth stressing that, because if you're watching this and you're a photographer and you're new to video, you may only be thinking of ISO in terms of exposure, whereas actually it's far more than that. It's also about dynamic range, how much or how little you have, but also where those stops of sensitivity above and below middle grey are shifted to as you move it up and down. Therefore, when you're exposing an image with video, this is why you would ideally set the camera, rate the camera where you're going to get the best balance of dynamic range versus noise, where you're going to get the optimum amount of depth of field based on the aperture, the optimum amount of motion blur based on the shutter, and at that point, see how your subject appears, and then light your subject to be exposed. That's how you should expose, really, in an ideal world, using light or ND to get the optimum exposure on your subject with the camera rated for the optimum amount of creative use of depth of field and motion blur, but also technical dynamic range, noise, floor, and all of those things combined. So just a side note about how this all impacts in terms of dynamic range is, I think, worth mentioning at this point before we dive into the custom picture modes, which we will do now.